Before we begin this video, I just want to thank all of you so far that has watched any of my content. The support that I have received has been outstanding, especially on that first Iron Man video. I love making this type of content, so seeing people enjoy that is amazing. So for those of you that have watched a video in the past, or even if this is your first time, thank you so much for watching. I hope I can continue making content that you love and also hopefully entertained by. Anyways, enough wholesome talk, let's get on with the video. Quick description for those that may not know much about this film. Iron Man 2 is the third movie released by Marvel Studios as part of the MCU, following after Iron Man 1 and The Incredible Hulk, both of which have reviews that I have already done, which you can check out after this video. Now, even though this film was the third one in the MCU, it already needed to do some course correction on the franchise. With both Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk coming out in 2008, it was quite obvious that one of these films had succeeded and one had not lived up to expectations. And so for Marvel to push forward, they first had to try and win back some people after the disappointment of The Incredible Hulk. And so an Iron Man sequel was in order to do some of that course correction. Everyone was back. Okay, nearly everyone was back. And so you'd expect this film to replicate the major success that the first film had accomplished.
I want my board.
Okay, maybe not. Critics at the time gave it a pretty reasonable score, but the general consensus was that this film was nowhere near the quality of the first. However, I think there's more to this film than meets the eye. And so in this video, I will try and answer the question, is Iron Man 2 better than you remembered? So where else best to go than to start with the main character of this film, Tony Stark. When looking at the success of the first film, people credit Robert Downey Jr. as being a huge reason for that. He did so well playing the complex character of Tony Stark, so much so that it ended up boosting his career massively, making him more popular than he had ever been before. When looking to the sequel, it was obvious that he was going to continue onwards, and people were excited to see what was to come for the character. The film starts off after the final scene in the first movie, where Tony announces to the world that he is Iron Man. After this announcement, we begin to see a different array of people trying to replicate and weaponize the suits that Tony has made, whether that's the government or the villains. And so we obviously see Tony try to keep hold of this invention, as we know the way he feels about these suits. We hear him say,
I am Iron Man. The suit and I are one. To turn over the Iron Man suit would be to turn over myself.
As an audience, we know the suffering and sacrifice Tony has had to go through in order to conceive the idea of the suit, as well as the changes he's had to make in his life thanks to it. And so it is understandable to see that Tony is not willing to give that up. However, even though we know Tony has started to grow and become a better person, we know he's not changed his ways completely, and has maybe even started to have his ego boosted further. We also begin to find out that Tony's arc reactor and suit are starting to kill him. And this plot thread is the foundation for the character in this movie. In several scenes we see Tony acting reckless and self-destructive because he thinks he doesn't have much longer left to live. We get to see our main hero once again at his worst, acting with a YOLO attitude, not caring about his actions or the people surrounding him. We even see Tony struggling to share this information with these people, and so we as an audience see Tony as a character who is still needing to grow. This growth ends up coming in the form of his father, a person who we find out Tony despises as he thinks that
He was cold, he was calculating. He never told me he loved me, he never even told me he liked me. We're talking about a guy whose happiest day was when he shipped me off to boarding school.
But as Tony is trying to find a new element to save his life, his father ends up playing a huge role in that. We first of all have this great scene of Tony seeing his father in a completely new way, with him saying,
"What is and always will be my greatest creation is you."
This scene is written and acted brilliantly as we start to see past wounds begin to heal in this moment. As an audience, we see with Tony what his dad was actually like, a person that ended up working more than he should but still cared for his family, and most importantly, for Tony. The thing that then seals this story thread is when we see Tony discover the element that he was looking for. We find out Tony's dad had made a diorama years ago which on the surface looked like nothing, but with greater inspection actually turned out to make up the element that Tony needed in order to save his life. And then, in one line by Tony, this whole arc gets a well-deserved payoff.
Thanks, Dad.
Tony has ended up healing another thing about his past, which ends up becoming a main trope within all the films that he's in. What I love about this is that it could have been so easy for the writers to just hand over to Tony the cure, or not even make him need it in the first place. But for Tony, in order to have physical healing, it too required emotional and mental healing too. All in all, Downey steals the show once again. There's a reason why he is so beloved as Iron Man, and it's because of how perfect he is for the role. And I envy anyone that is going to take over from him in the future. Speaking of roles being taken over, as you probably knew, the role of Tony's best pal Rhodey was taken over by Don Cheadle in this movie. That is because the original actor Terrence Howard was apparently offered a lower paycheck than he was originally contracted for, as Marvel needed that money to fulfill Downey's increased wages. As much as it was a shame to see Terrence Howard get mugged off by Marvel, Don Cheadle does great coming into this role. They introduce him with a very tongue-in-cheek moment where he says,
"Look, it's me, I'm here, deal with it, let's move on."
Which lets the audience know, yes, we've got someone different, but we don't need to focus on it. That is because Cheadle ends up taking on this role really well, allowing him to show the character's friendship and annoyance for Tony. Now, something great that we didn't end up seeing in the first film is Rhodey wearing an Iron Man suit. Luckily, we get that in this film a couple of times. The first is at Tony's birthday party, right after Tony drunkenly puts people's lives at risk. Up to this point, Rhodey had been backing Tony in terms of looking after his invention, but this had crossed the line, and so looking to teach his friend a lesson, we see a fight between Tony and Rhodey. In this fight, we start to see Rhodey begin to take the first steps into becoming War Machine, a character that he would end up growing into in future films. But this wouldn't be the only setup for the future. It hadn't even scratched the surface yet. For those that don't know, at the end of Iron Man, Nick Fury ends up making an appearance before Tony, telling him about the Avengers Initiative. However, for the first half of this film, we don't really see much come from that. Until after Tony's birthday, where after Rhodey has taken Tony's suit, Nick Fury finally confronts Tony. At this point, we've seen Tony do several reckless things, and Fury points out that this must only be because Tony might be dying. We actually find out that he's not just guessing, because he had already sent in a spy to keep tabs on Tony, which is where we are also introduced to Black Widow. Now, even though we had seen Fury at the end of the first Iron Man, this was still a huge thing for Marvel fans, as it pushed them closer into having a shared universe. At this point, it was known that they were trying to start off a huge franchise, and so this film ends up being littered with loads of Easter eggs and setups in order to progress the franchise. However, as much as some people love that, and in a way I do, I still do find it distracting from the film itself. In a way, what makes the first Iron Man so great is how simplistic and focused it feels, because it's not setting up anything else. Now, in this movie, it's not as bad as it could have been, but this setup still feels a little bit jarring. However, it is S.H.I.E.L.D. that begins to help Tony with his healing process that I mentioned earlier. Fury is the one that explains to Tony about how important and loving his dad really was, whilst giving him the information needed to help cure Tony. and so even though having S.H.I.E.L.D. in the film did make it a little less focused, they did have purpose within the story, while still being able to set up for the future. Now that we've focused on all the main heroes in the story, it's time to look at the villains.
Stop! Have a time!
After only having Jeff Bridges as the main villain in the first movie, they decided to double down in this film by having two major villains. The main one being Whiplash, played by Mickey Rourke, who is the son of a famous scientist who worked with Howard Stark. We find out that Whiplash's dad had been hard done by, and so he decides to take revenge by trying to kill Tony with a version of his own creation. Now, when looking at the impact Whiplash has made to the MCU, most people either don't remember him or they remember the bad stuff. However, there is actually quite a lot of good things about this character, especially in certain scenes. Now, Mickey Rourke originally signed on wanting to have a deep backstory for this character, which is where we see this vengeance originally come from. This leads him to the first time he attacks Tony, in probably the most remembered scene of this film, the Grand Prix scene. In this scene we see Whiplash come out onto the racetrack where Tony is racing, armed with his electric whips powered by the arc reactor. This entire scene is so pleasing from an aesthetic and action driven point of view. However, there is a plot hole with this scene. A few moments before, we find out Tony has literally just decided to take part in this race. So why would Whiplash be there in the pits? He might have known that Tony was going to be there on holiday, but there's no way he would have been able to break in there with no warning. But it seems the writers have forgotten about logic and decide to distract us with these amazing visuals. This fight, although small, gives us a taster of what this villain could potentially be, as he poses a huge threat to Tony as he has the same technology as him. It is then that we start to realise who the second villain is of the movie, Justin Hammer. Now, first of all, Sam Rockwell does really well in this performance. It's quite funny that he plays a character wanting to act similarly to Stark, as Rockwell actually originally auditioned to play Tony Stark. Obviously that wasn't the case, but I'm glad we got to see him in the MCU, and maybe not for the last time. Anyways, once Hammer sees the intellect of Whiplash and his vengeance for Stark, he breaks him out of prison. This is because Hammer wants Whiplash to create for him multiple Iron Man suits, which he would show off at the Stark Expo, humiliating Tony Stark. This relationship seems great at first, with both of them acting on the same page. However, we begin to see Whiplash's real intentions for why he is helping out Hammer. Not to create suits, but instead drones, which would be used to kill Stark. Now, as much as these two villains have real standout moments, there's still not enough for me to say that they are brilliant villains. That is because not enough is fleshed out within each character. Yes, Whiplash is cool and has good motives, but his character ends up becoming two-dimensional real quick. And Hammer, although brimming with personality, isn't really much of a threat. And so with two mediocre villains, we are left coming into the final showdown of this movie. But surely, after the letdown of the original Iron Man's finale, they wouldn't go down the same road, would they?
No! Please, no! No! No!
Good to be back.
No!
Oh great, Marvel has done it again. It's time to revisit the evil twin dilemma.
Deja vu! I just been in this place before. Higher on the street, and I know it's my time to go.
As I mentioned in the last two MCU reviews on the channel, I mentioned a trope commonly used within a lot of Marvel movies, which I like to call the evil twin dilemma. The evil twin dilemma is when the main villain of the movie ends up being an evil version of the good guy. We see it in the first Iron Man, as Jeff Bridges plays the Ironmonger, which is literally just him in a bigger Iron Man suit. Now, when we first see Whiplash, there's enough of a difference to not make him a member of the ETD. However, it seems the writers didn't want to stick with that, and ended up having the final showdown between Iron Man and War Machine against a bunch of drones. And once they've destroyed them, they then have to face Whiplash in an Iron Man suit.
I hate so much about the things that you choose to be.
It just doesn't end up making the showdown tense in any way because you've seen this before. And also it means that there's nothing visually new about it either, so it ends up being extremely underwhelming. Actually, the scene after this was even more tense when Tony had to save Pepper from the drone bomb. And there's something seriously wrong if that scene has more suspense about it than your final fight between the good and bad guys. And so once again, we end on a low. But that's not completely it. We actually get a payoff to the setup of Tony and Pepper's relationship. In this film, as well as the first one, there was definitely a spark between the two. However, nothing came of it, until Tony decides to kiss her at the end. Because of the wait, this felt deserved. Maybe not as much as it could have been, but it rounds off Tony's character really well, as he's finally willing to be vulnerable with the one woman he truly cares for. So at least this time we ended on a pretty good note, as well as a few more setup moments added for good measure. Then finally, with one last funny scene to end the movie, we then roll credits for the second Iron Man film. So how would I rate this movie? Now, as I've said already, this film can't compare to the original. However, I still think it was better than what people give it credit for. Yes, it might have been a little overstuffed with world building, but I think that was important to the franchise as a whole. And that's sometimes a negative within franchise films. But the thing is, it still had a great main protagonist with some great character growth. It also had some really standout scenes that is still remembered today by fans. And even though the villains weren't as great as they could have been, there's enough to work with to at least get one of them back in the MCU to continue expanding on that character. And so, after having a stuffed plot, but amazing standout moments and mesmerizing CGI, I would like to give this film a respectable 6 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching this video. Once again, I am grateful for all the support shown to the channel so far. It would be so amazing if you enjoyed this video to also show some support by hitting that like button, or even subscribing to the channel, as there's plenty more Marvel reviews coming in the future. Speaking of which, there might be a certain God of Thunder which needs looking at in the next video. Hopefully I'll see you all then. Have a great day and stay safe. Bye!